Thank you, Greg, and I really want to thank the Firehouse Center for the Arts for inviting us here to speak tonight at the North Shore Lecture Series, and thank you all for being here tonight. It's great to see so many faces here to hear us talk about this heavy topic, but we hope there's some moments of levity as well as we begin to talk. So let's get started. Why do beautiful pictures of war, poverty, and disease matter? To answer that question, let's start out by talking about what we mean by beauty. I think most of us can agree that this picture here is beautiful. The tonalities, composition, texture, and subject matter are stunning. The photo is by a French photographer, Philippe Gesslin. It was published in Zeke magazine in an article on the last of the Inuit hunters, and is about how climate change, the most existential threat of our time, is affecting traditional lifestyles of Inuit hunters in Greenland. We're in thinner ice here with this photograph by an American photojournalist, Paula Bronstein, of an elderly war victim in Ukraine. While it is very artfully composed and a sensitive portrait of a woman who remains in a contested war zone, many may find it difficult to consider this picture beautiful. This third photo by Magnum photographer Gilles Perez was taken in Bosnia in 1996 of bodies exhumed from mass graves. Gilles is a renowned photographer and recipient of numerous awards. There's no doubt that if we divorce this photo from the subject matter, on all other accounts it is beautiful, with its attention to form, shadow, texture, composition, and motion through the frame. Regardless of how this photo masters the visual vocabulary of art history, it is difficult to look at, and to many viewers, it may not be beautiful at all.
This photo by Ron Habib is probably one of the most memorable and lasting images from the Bosnian War, taken shortly after the war began in 1992. A relatively peaceful and prosperous country was turned into a nightmare because of the violent actions of nationalist Serbs intent on cleansing large areas of the country of Bosnian Muslims. While this photo in particular is not too kind to viewers, it served its purpose of waking up both the public and policymakers to become aware about what was happening in Bosnia and to take action. There have been some other notable ordinary photos that have had a profound effect on moving people to care and to take action. A recent case in point is this photo here of Ilan Kurdi, taken by Turkish photographer Nilüfer Demir. There's nothing particularly interesting about the aesthetic qualities of this photo, but the raw facts don't require anything else. There's no image from the war in Syria, more than this one, that brought the reality of this war home to a complacent public and moved government officials, most notably German Chancellor Angela Merkel, to open their borders to refugees. This may have turned out to be a political disaster for Merkel, but it was a lifeline for millions fleeing war and persecution.
A lesser-known body of work from the war in Syria is called the Caesar photos. In August 2013, a Syrian military defector, codenamed Caesar, smuggled 53,000 photographs out of Syria. His task as a soldier was to photograph detainees killed in 5 of Bashar al-Assad's notorious prisons. Of these photos, they show at least 10,000 detainees who died in detention after being transferred to a military hospital. These are among the more horrific photos ever made available to the public, documenting the horrors of war and human torture. Allow me to show just one of these photos tonight. These photos are not commonly known among the public. Can I see it on your hands if anybody has been familiar with the Caesar photos before tonight? Has anybody heard of them? So a few people have, but they're clearly not commonly known. But the Caesar photos have had a profound effect in the halls of Congress and throughout the global policy community. There's even a bipartisan bill sitting on President Trump's desk right now titled the Caesar-Syria Civilian Protection Act that will financially punish Bashar al-Assad and his associates and will provide additional support to protect civilians in Syria. which continue to be killed as we speak today in the Idlib province, most noticeably by Russian planes. We're presenting the Caesar photos as an example of images that have zero aesthetic qualities, but the documentary facts are so important that they've compelled action that will save lives in Syria.
The Caesar photos play an important role in truth-telling and have played an even more important role in ensuring justice and accountability. But there's a reason we can't look at these photos for too long without feeling sadness, anger, disgust, even apathy. So tonight we're making the case that there's an important place for beauty when addressing the human condition through photography. And this presentation will focus on the space between these two photos.
My background is in photography, graphic design, and humanitarian work.
And my background is in human rights and photography, but it's photography where our work overlaps, literally on the battlefields of Bosnia during the war in the 1990s. Here, Glenn and I are in Bosnia in 1996, observing the destruction of Dobrinja, a suburb of Sarajevo.
I found myself in Bosnia after starting a humanitarian organization called Friends of Bosnia in 1993. By 1995, I was in Bosnia delivering aid and finally turning my camera on what was going on around me. I'd already done quite a bit of documentary work prior to this point, but my interest in Bosnia was driven more by the human issues than by the photography. It was when I was actually in Bosnia that I started paying attention to the photographic possibilities.
I was working with Physicians for Human Rights, also known as PHR, a leading human rights organization documenting atrocities against civilians and exhuming mass graves in Srebrenica to collect forensic evidence of war crimes and trying to identify missing persons. At PHR, these were the photos I worked with day after day. Photos by Gilles Perez of mass atrocities that made their way into a book called The Graves. The photos were ultimately used to help indict Radovan Karadzic and Slobodan Milosevic at the war crimes tribunals in The Hague. It was mind-numbing work. At the same time, I came upon Sebastião Salgado's Workers book, and these photos transformed for me the power of photography and made me feel empowered and hopeful for humanity.
In 1996, we went to Bosnia, and then in 2000 to Kosovo, with another photographer, Frank Ward, to produce traveling photography exhibitions on the wars and reconstruction. I was focused on the photography and exhibition design, Barbara more so on the writing. We focused on people who lived through the war and documented their stories of strength and dignity, despite the horrors around them. This particular photo here was taken in 1995 during the war at the base of Mount Igman on the way into Sarajevo. He was a refugee from another part of Bosnia where he was driven out. And these are some other photos from these exhibits. This is Nermina and Melissa, also in the same refugee center at the base of Mount Igman. And this photo is of Kosovar refugees in Macedonia. Are these photographs beautiful? I hope you would think some of them are. At best, they're a generous presentation of the reality in Bosnia and Kosovo, focusing on ordinary people and how the wars affected them. We exhibited these photos in dozens of locations across the US. We made a website of each of these exhibits that were viewed by thousands, and I used these images in speaking presentations about the wars in Bosnia and in Kosovo. Does the fact that they are artfully composed and hewed towards traditional principles of fine art matter? Clearly, the structure that you see in many documentary photos today do not veer too far from the traditions developed 700 years ago during the Renaissance. The photo on the left is of Kosovar refugees that I took in Macedonia in 1999, and the painting on the right was from the workshop of Renaissance painter Giovanni Bellini 700 years ago. That is the crux of this talk, isn't it? Barbara and I believe strongly that beauty and aesthetics matter. Otherwise, viewers will be left feeling helpless, possibly despairing, missing out on complex and multifaceted understandings. Even in the worst situations, there is still the human spirit and human dignity that needs to be respected.
The most remarkable realization to anyone who visited Bosnia during the war is how ordinary people in Sarajevo, who were being shelled, sniped at, starved, frozen, would still demand their dignity and would insist that if the world were to see them, they would see them wearing their best clothes. They would invite you into their homes to have their few remaining rounds of coffee. One of the Bosnians we stayed with shined his shoes every time he left the house. This is not hyperbole, as anyone who visited Bosnia during the war would agree. This photo here is by British photojournalist Tom Stoddard, taken in Dobrinja, a suburb of Sarajevo, on the front lines during the war. This next photo from our Bosnia exhibit is by Frank Ward, of a writer, Mirsad, in his home in Sarajevo.
Farida Mushanovic, in this photo, also taken by Frank Ward, was a music teacher at the Sarajevo Arts Institute and continued to teach piano right through the war, even though her home in the center of Sarajevo was shelled numerous times by Serbs firing from the hills surrounding her city. The Mushanovic family often did not have heat or water in their home, and Farida's husband worked at the Sarajevo hospital, where he regularly cared for the wounded. If the Bosnians were insisting on maintaining their dignity during their darkest days, why would photographers try to take that away from them with photographs that presented them with less than dignity?
Darfur in Western Sudan, I was still working with Physicians for Human Rights and trying to gain international support to prevent atrocities being committed by government forces and the Janjaweed militia. During this time, we sent a team of researchers to Darfur, and for the first time, we sent a photographer, Michael Wadley. Afterward, we produced numerous reports that were delivered to governments, scholars, and other NGOs, providing quantitative analysis of the killings and the destruction. The reports were filled with charts and graphs demonstrating the destruction of villages, homes, farms, and people. But we also produced this book of Michael Wadley's photos. I'm sure you can tell which one of these reports was more effective in getting people to understand just a little bit about who the Fur people are and how they were living during the war. And most important, by looking at these photos, the victims of this violence were not faceless numbers, but they were human beings. Yes, horrible abuses were occurring, and it was important to document the facts. But it is these photos that proved so effective in gaining massive public support to end these atrocities. These are stunningly beautiful photos that really mattered and showed another truth. In a beautiful photograph, a photographer finds inherent strength, dignity, and beauty in subjects who are overcoming despair and exhibiting inner strength in ways that the subjects themselves sometimes don't even know resides within them.
In 2008, with the wars in Bosnia and Darfur over, we focused our attention on documentary photography and founded the Social Documentary Network and later Zeke magazine. Since 2008, I've devoted much of my time promoting the work of documentary photographers from across the globe who focus on global themes, many of them difficult and challenging, such as the war in Syria, maternal health in Africa, climate change, the war in Ukraine, ISIS, and people living with AIDS. This is not all we focus on, though, and much of the work on SDN and in Zeke magazine include more uplifting themes, such as Black cowboys in Mississippi, women farmers in Africa, Vietnam today, or Inuit hunters in Greenland. But it is the former themes that is most relevant to this discussion tonight. Documentary photography boldly engages with and responds to the tumultuous times we live in. It is a call for justice. It enlightens us, and it gives us hope. And unlike photojournalism, which is a close cousin to documentary photography, effective documentary always borrows from the aesthetics of the fine art tradition. And let us now show you a few of the nearly 3,500 exhibits on the SDN website. And if our internet connection works, hopefully this will work fine. So I'm going to start out just by showing you the homepage of the Social Documentary Network website. This is a live website. If you went to SDN right now, this is exactly what you would see. And currently we're having a call for entries for work from Africa. So you'll notice that a lot of work is from Africa. And some of this work will be published in the next issue of Zeke magazine. Since we started the website, we've published more than 3,300 exhibits on the site by more than 2,000 photographers from all over the world on diverse themes. And if you click on any one of these larger images on the SDN homepage, it'll take you into a more detailed exhibit with text about the theme in a more general way, and then individual captions for each image. So let's take a look at some of these exhibits on the SDN website. This first one is by a German photographer, Toby Binder, titled Youth of Belfast. And Toby was one of the two first place winners of the 2019 Zeke Awards for documentary photography. This exhibit is about youth of Belfast today and the alienation that they're experiencing 20 years after the signing of the Good Friday Agreement, which ostensibly, or really did, stop the violence between the Catholic and Protestant sides of Belfast. But today, 20 years later, the youth have incredible anxiety about their future, largely caused by Brexit, because Brexit has created this uncertainty as to what their future will bring. And in 2 days, Brexit will be law, and there'll be a hard border between Northern Ireland and Great Britain, much to the chagrin of people in Northern Ireland. And you can see how Toby has used these very formal portraits contrasted with more street-type photography. His work is all shot in film, which is very rare today, but Toby comes out of a fine art tradition and really believes in the possibilities of film compared to digital. You wouldn't know from the captions or looking at these photographs if these young people are from the Protestant or Catholic sides of Belfast, which is intentional, because Toby's position is that it really doesn't matter what side of Belfast you're on, the difficulties and anxieties of the youth are very similar. I've always been very drawn to this photograph, just the absolute enthusiasm in this young girl's face in this road race. Meanwhile, she's surrounded by these highly armored security vehicles that obviously are necessary to provide security for her while she's running and other runners. These youth obviously have less enthusiasm looking off into the distance, possibly thinking about their future possibilities. And again, back to these formal portraits. This photograph was used on the cover of the current issue of Zeke magazine. Really extraordinary, sensitive portraits. This is a very powerful picture. I think you could read what it says across his shoulder there. Strength, respect, loyalty. And let's look at some other exhibits, on the SDN website. This one is called The Endless Wait by Kashmiri photographer Shaukat Nanda. This is about women and primarily mothers in Kashmir whose children have been detained and often killed by the security forces, and they wait up till decades to find out what has happened to them. And you could see how these photographs very clearly draw from the traditions of fine art as we know it. I mean, this could be a Vermeer painting of a woman at a window with a pearl earring. Here, a family member has received some shards of clothing from their missing loved ones. But again, a very highly developed sense of aesthetics with all of these photos of form and contrast, shape, to address very difficult issues. And one thing about many of these exhibits that we'll be showing is that the photographers really spend a lot of time in these situations. It's not like they're just in the situation for a day or two. And you can tell by the captions where they often identify the people and very specific information. The caption for this photo, which maybe if you're up in the front row you can read, but allow me to read it. Hussein Bibi lives with her children in Zamor, Patan village, near the line of control that divides India and Pakistan, administered Kashmir. Her husband, Ahmed Hussein Shah, and son, Nazir Hussein, were picked up from their home by the Jammu and Kashmir Rifle Regiments of the Indian Army in 1977. So by reading that, I mean, in addition to the facts that I'm reading, I also just want to get across how much the photographers really understand this situation in depth. Here, this woman has received some earth from the grave of her child who had disappeared decades ago. This exhibit has a very similar feel, but a very different subject matter. It's by a Greek photographer, Angelos Sortsinis, titled Trapped in Greece. And it's about migrants traveling through southern Europe on their way into Central Europe, but are stuck in Greece at the border with Macedonia, as you can see with this fence here. And Angelos has used this wide panorama technique to provide some formal possibilities that a normal 2x3 35mm format doesn't allow for this more panoramic view. And at the center of this picture, here we are again with a mother and child, one of the most ubiquitous themes or motifs throughout global art history, not just Western art history. This exhibit is by an Israeli photographer, Ruti Alan, about rural Roma communities in Romania. And what's always been interesting about this exhibit for me is that these are stunningly beautiful photos, probably some of the most beautiful photos on the SDN website, but they're about such difficult situations, the abject poverty that the Roma live in here in Romania, and by extension through other parts of Europe. While these photographs are about very difficult themes, they've allowed us to really talk about the situation of Roma. These photographs were published in the last issue of Zeke magazine and allowed us to present a lot of information about the condition of Roma in Europe today. And not everything on the SDN website is of faraway places. This exhibit is by a Boston-based photographer, Edward Boches, titled Seeking Glory, photographed in the old industrial mill towns north of Boston, primarily Lowell and other mill towns. But they're about boxing gyms, these old boxing gyms that have been around for a long time, and about how they're used by both the boxers and the trainers to gain a sense of self-esteem that is hard to gain otherwise in these depressed old mill towns. Boches has a background in advertising prior to retiring and devoting his time to photography. So you can see he has a very developed sense of aesthetics, of form and composition, lighting, contrast. This last exhibit I'll show is by photojournalist Danielle Villasana, called A Light Inside. This is about trans women in Peru and the discrimination, the difficulties, the health issues they face in their very macho-oriented country. But they're very stunningly beautiful photos of a difficult situation, very personal. These are not stereotypes, they're human beings. You can tell by these photos that they're not meant to be just glossed over, but they're real people with real issues. And like many of the exhibits that we've photographed and we show here, it's not all difficult stuff. I mean, people in the worst situations show joy and happiness and have friendships and relationships, and that's important to show as well. Incredibly intimate moment, a very difficult moment to catch in a photograph. The caption for this is, Joshua left. Orlana's on and off again boyfriend leans in to kiss her before she leaves for work. Though he says that living with her helps him lead a better life, he also talks about how the relationship is not right under the eyes of God.
So as Glenn said, we review and evaluate these projects on the SDN website for a combination of the aesthetic qualities of the photos, how well the photos tell the story, and in combination with the text. If the photos are not well composed, if they're boring, poorly lit, lacking focus, we probably won't feature them. When viewers are looking at the SDN website or at Zeek magazine, it is primarily the photographs that draw on traditional notions of aesthetics that first bring viewers in, regardless of the subject matter. A viewer is not going to delve deeper into a story that starts with a mediocre photo. But once they enter, we can educate the viewer and help them understand complex socio-political issues, and hopefully they'll learn more and they'll get involved. Again, I want to come back to the photos that make us confront our common humanity, such as this one of the Roma. Something that photography is particularly adept at doing. And all of these photographers have spent a lot of time with their subjects, building relationships with them. And I'd like to now take a look at the work of one of the masters of this, Joseph Koudelka, one of the greatest documentary photographers alive today, famous for his photos of the Soviet army crushing the Prague Spring in 1968, and then a decades-long body of work on Eastern European Roma. There were many agency photojournalists in Prague in 1968, but Koudelka, more steeped in art than journalism, created the enduring photos from this moment in history, such as these. And his photographs of Eastern European Roma are considered some of the greatest documentary work from the later half of the 20th century. Glenn and I had a wonderful opportunity to hear the 82-year-old Koudelka talk at Paris Photo this past November, where he made a case that his intent is to make great photos, and that the texture, lifestyle, and tonality of the Roma were his canvas to do this. Is he exploiting the Roma, though, for his own career as an artist? I think the answer to that is complex, and we're not going to get to that answer tonight, but what is very true is that he had tremendous respect and empathy for the Roma. And Roma are among the most discriminated and persecuted people in the world. The Roma died in Nazi extermination camps in numbers just less than that of the Jewish population. And today, throughout Europe, Roma continue to suffer tremendous discrimination and harassment. So it is not incidental that Koudelka focused his camera and attention on this group. He spent decades working on this project. He launched these enduring works of art into our culture, and we can take from them what we want. But what we cannot ignore is the love he had for the Roma and the dignity and respect that these images communicate to the viewer. He's an outstanding artist and skillfully and powerfully communicates his empathy toward human beings. And that is as much an enduring testament to the Roma as any photo. Koudelka's work is as clear a case there is of why beautiful pictures of war, poverty, and disease matter.
Another photographer, less known outside photo circles, is an Egyptian photographer, Hiba Kamis, who's documented the practice of breast ironing in the West African nation of Cameroon. Mothers in Cameroon will iron their daughters' breasts using heated cooking tools and other objects, including coconut shells, grinding stones, spatulas, and hammers heated over coals. Mothers hope that flattening the breasts of their daughters delays maturity or makes it invisible. They're trying to protect their daughters from rape and early marriage with techniques that leave enduring scars. These photos by Hiba were published on the SDN website, in the women's issue of Zeke magazine, and in other media. They're hauntingly beautiful photos that have brought this practice of breast ironing, both the violence of the act and the need for it, to the attention of a public that has not been aware of it previously.
Seeing something that is beautiful, that represents something awful, is often unexpected. It makes you do a double take. It makes you stop and take a second look. It draws you in and helps you reconsider the issue. Maybe it is more complex or more human than obvious. Humanity does not always win. In some cases, the horrors are so great, the perpetrators are so debased, the victims so broken, that it's not clear if the species will survive. There are no comforting photos from the Holocaust. And this week commemorates the 75th anniversary of the liberation of Auschwitz and Birkenau. Viktor Frankl, an Austrian neurologist and psychiatrist who lost his whole family during the Nazis' attempt to exterminate the Jews, counseled his fellow prisoners with a philosophy that argued that striving for meaning and beauty, not pleasure nor power, is what keeps us alive. Frankl was not an artist, but in the throes of the worst horrors faced by humanity, he invoked the only thing left to camp prisoners facing a near certain death, a belief that finding meaning and beauty can heal. It can help transcend any adversity and help discover a guiding truth for survival. Self-taught Roma artist Chaya Stoica, an Auschwitz survivor, turned the ordeals of the camp into art of immense power with a series of 1,000 paintings and drawings, such as this one, which appeared yesterday in the cover of the New York Times art section. Is this not what artists the world over, and certainly photographers, are always striving to insist on? That amidst chaos, meaning and beauty can prevail.
This image is from an early issue of Zeke magazine by Maryam Ashrafi, an Iranian photographer now living in Paris, who's been documenting Kurdish women fighters battling ISIS. In her exhibit on SDN titled Mourning Kobani, Ashrafi made this stunning photograph of a young woman who, along with other members of the YPJ, the Women's Protection Units, are mourning during a ceremony for Ajiri, their fellow fighter, who was killed during clashes with the Islamic State. This photograph is not of dead comrades or headless victims of the despicable Islamic State. Rather, it is a stunning portrait, shot not in a studio with lights and assistants, but rather under challenging wartime conditions during a funeral wrought with intense emotions under the constant threat of attack. The young woman's eyes, her gaze, her colorful scarf and military fatigues, the soft blue sky and horizon lines so thoughtfully placed, and the woman on the left side of the frame, possibly injured in battle, all create a stunning work of art. How can one not be moved by this? What happened? Who are they? This photo is a weapon against the horrors of the Islamic State. Its secondary target is all who say that women cannot engage in triumph in battle. The power of this beautiful photo of a Kurdish warrior, I hope, has launched 1,000 people to join her struggle to save the Kurds and other residents of Kobani from ISIS. Tragically, Serena, the subject of this photo, was killed in battle in the fall of 2018, 2 years after this photo was taken.
This second photo from Zeke is by David Verburg, a Belgian photographer, who in this case is documenting displaced pastoralists in Somaliland. This photo is from his exhibit on the SDN website titled "Waiting for Rain," about climate refugees from Somaliland who have lost their livestock due to a drought made worse by the changing climate. She is one of 4,500 displaced persons living near the capital of Somaliland, now fully dependent on humanitarian aid for their subsistence. Most have abandoned their nomadic way of life and have settled in makeshift camps where aid and food can reach them. This is a powerful frontal portrait of a woman looking intensely into our eyes. There's no question of her disappointment in her current situation as a refugee. But she's not a faceless victim. She's wearing a beautiful turquoise scarf and earth-colored head covering. Her expression is not of pathos, but rather the expression we see in our own mothers the world over, an expression of familiarity, compassion, and fate. Verburg uses the simple but effective visual tool of selective focus. The woman's face is in sharp focus, while the background recedes into a blur. This may be a textbook example of how to make a good portrait. The colors, the intense lighting across the woman's face, how her head and shoulders so perfectly fill the frame, the sweep and rhythms of shadows starting in the lower left and ending with her black headband. This also becomes a lasting comment on human strength amidst adversity. It is also a statement on how the human soul, both the subject's and Verburg's, lives, struggles, and perseveres. What effect does David Verburg's photos have on either global climate change or the displaced pastoralists in Somaliland? What effect does Maryam Ashrafi's photos from Kurdistan have on defeating ISIS? I hope these photos appear in venues bigger than SDN or Zeek magazine, and I hope people see these images and perhaps gain greater insight and empathy for victims of climate change or ISIS, and perhaps be driven to action.
Photographers such as David Verbeck and Maryam Ashrafi, and tens of thousands of others who lift their cameras and have worked tirelessly to make great photos, have themselves taken a stand against complacency because they have been anything but complacent. They make us confront the basic fact that amid suffering in the world, there is also beauty. But beauty is not separate from suffering. On the contrary, perfection and beauty gives us hope that things can be different and things can be better, that we can rally, we're an intelligent species, and we can rise from the ashes to heal. The human soul lives, struggles, and perseveres.
In the struggle for human dignity, beauty matters. If we succumb to the raw and chaotic facts of daily human struggle by creating equally as raw and chaotic images, then we have not used our human intelligence, creativity, and capacity for empathy to rise above it all. For all who strive for beauty in the face of suffering, it is an act of defiance against those who bring misery to this planet. We have entered a new decade, the 2020s, hopefully a time where we will see and capture the world clearly with perfect vision and fully appreciate all of its beauty.
In closing, we'd just like to show this brief video.